at possibly the most boring spa in the world. This is not a complaint. It is another quiet morning at possibly the most boring spa in the world. This is not a complaint. The people who worked there would not have described it as boring. They would have described it as consistent, which is a word that boring people use when they want to say boring, but mean it as a compliment. The spa opened at 8 a.m. It had always opened at 8 a.m. There had been a brief discussion in 2019 about opening at 7:30, and everyone agreed it was worth considering, and then no one had mentioned it again. And the matter had resolved itself in the way that most matters at the spa resolved themselves, which was quietly and without drama, and in favour of things staying exactly as they were. The first task of the morning belonged to Gerald. Gerald was responsible for the pool. Specifically, Gerald was responsible for the pH level of the pool, which he checked at 8:04 every morning, using a small kit that he kept in a Ziploc bag in his left breast pocket. The reading that morning was 7.3, which was acceptable. Gerald wrote 7.3 in the logbook, underlined it once, and allowed himself a small nod. Not a celebratory nod, more of a confirmatory one. The nod of a man for whom 7.3 was not a victory, but simply the correct answer. At 8:17, Sandra called across the corridor to no one in particular, and everyone in general, to ask if anyone had adjusted the sauna temperature. It was currently at 49 degrees. It was supposed to be 47, which was incredibly cold for a sauna, but no one wanted it to be too exciting. There was a brief silence of the kind that follows an announcement of mild but genuine concern. Then Derek said he hadn't touched it. Sandra said she hadn't suggested he had. Derek said he knew. Sandra said good. The sauna was adjusted to 47 degrees, and the corridor returned to its usual quiet, which was the kind of quiet that felt slightly warmer than actual silence, like a room that people have just left, but haven't quite. By 9 a.m. the first guests had arrived and been shown to the changing rooms by a young woman named Philippa, who had worked at the spa for 3 years, and had developed the particular gift of making people feel entirely welcome without saying anything that could later be described as memorable. She smiled in a way that was warm but not excessive. She gestured towards the lockers in a way that was helpful but not showy. And when a guest asked if the robes were Egyptian cotton, she said yes, they were, in a tone that suggested this was both true and not the most interesting thing she had said that day, even though it probably was. The spa, by the way, was called Tranquil Waters, which was almost accurate. There was one water feature, a small wall-mounted affair in the reception area that had been installed in 2014 and had worked reliably until 2016, when it began making a sound that the maintenance man described as not ideal. It had been switched off, and no one had mentioned it since, though it was still there on the wall, looking like something that had once had ambitions. The manager was a man called Robert. Not Rob, not Bob. Robert. He'd mentioned this during his interview 12 years ago, and had not felt the need to bring it up again, as no one had ever called him anything else. Robert was 51, of medium height, and had the kind of face that people struggled to describe afterward. Not because it was unusual, but because it was so entirely usual that it left no particular impression, like a wall that has been painted the right colour. He drove a Volvo that he was quietly pleased with, and spent his weekends checking the pressure in his tyres and watching documentaries about infrastructure. He had recently finished a 4-part series about the M6 motorway, and had found it, in his own words, very informative. Sandra was 44 and had worked at the spa for 9 years, which she mentioned occasionally. Not to complain, but simply as a piece of information she felt was relevant. She was responsible for the sauna, the steam room, and a third room that was listed on the brochure as the Salt Cave, though it had never actually been a salt cave. It had been planned as one in 2018, when Robert had attended a wellness conference in Swindon, and returned with a brochure and a level of enthusiasm that was, for Robert, significant. The salt had been ordered, then cancelled, then reordered, and then there had been an issue with the ventilation survey, and eventually the room had been carpeted and fitted with a small fountain that also no longer worked. It was now used for something called quiet reflection, which was not a class or a treatment, but simply a room where guests could sit, which most of them did in silence, which had been the intention of the Salt Cave anyway. So, Robert considered it a partial success. Gerald was 38 and had worked at the spa for 6 years and 47 days, and was, by his own assessment, and the assessment of everyone who had ever met him, extremely interested in water chemistry. Not in a way that he spoke about unprompted, but in a way that meant if you did ask him about it, you would need to have made no other plans for the afternoon. He lived alone in a flat above a dry cleaner's, which he liked because it was quiet, and spent his evenings reading trade publications and maintaining a spreadsheet that tracked the pH levels of the pool going back to the day he had started. The spreadsheet had, in his opinion, several very interesting trends. He had mentioned this to Sandra once. She had said, "Right." He had not mentioned it again, but remained privately confident that she would come to appreciate the data in time. The first guest of the day was a woman named Margaret, who arrived at 8:58, 2 minutes before the spa opened, and waited outside without complaint, standing very still beneath the awning while the rain continued as it had been doing since before anyone had arrived. She came every other Thursday, booked the same treatment, a 50-minute back massage, and always requested the same therapist, a young man called Tom, who she described to her friend Janet as very thorough, which was the highest compliment she gave anyone. She brought her own water in a reusable bottle she had owned for 7 years, and had no intention of replacing. She signed in at reception, accepted a robe from Philippa with a small nod, and made her way to the changing room in the unhurried manner of a woman who had absolutely nowhere else to be, and was entirely comfortable with that fact. The reception area was painted in a colour that the brochure described as warm stone, which was accurate in the sense that it was the colour of a stone, and warm in the sense that it was not cold. There were 3 framed prints on the wall, each depicting a pebble. Not the same pebble, but 3 different pebbles arranged in a sequence that suggested intention without quite achieving it. Below the prints was a shelf containing 3 candles that had never been lit, a small succulent that was doing its best, and a laminated card that said, "Welcome to your journey," which Robert had ordered in 2021 and occasionally wondered about, but had never removed. The lighting throughout the spa was designed to be soothing, and it was in the way that slightly dim places are soothing by default. It was not quite bright enough to read comfortably, and not quite dark enough to feel atmospheric. It existed in a middle region that the designer had called restorative, and which Gerald privately called inadequate, though only to himself. The corridor that led from reception to the treatment rooms was carpeted in a deep taupe that had been chosen from a catalogue by Robert and Sandra on a Tuesday afternoon in 2017. A process that had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes and had resulted in taupe, which they had both agreed was the right decision, and neither had thought about since. Tom, the massage therapist, was 29 and had been a massage therapist at the spa for 4 years and 15 days. He was competent, punctual, and had the hands, as one guest had once written in the feedback form, of someone who takes their job seriously, which Tom had read 3 times and then folded into his wallet. He was a man of very few words during the treatment, not out of unfriendliness, but out of professional focus and a mild uncertainty about what to say to someone who is face down on a table. Margaret arrived in the treatment room at 9:06. Arranged herself on the table with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this many times, and settled her face into the headrest. There was a silence of about 90 seconds, during which Tom applied the oil, and Margaret stared through the headrest at the floor, which was tiled in a grey that matched nothing in particular and everything in general. Then Margaret said, "It's still raining." Tom said, "Yes, I can hear it." Margaret said, "It was raining when I came in." Tom said, There was another silence. Margaret said, "Do you find it affects bookings, the rain?" Tom considered this. He said he wasn't sure. Margaret said she supposed people still needed massages regardless of the rain. Tom agreed that they probably did, and that was the end of that. And they continued in a silence that was, on balance, preferable to most conversations either of them had heard that week. At 10:14 a.m., a man named Brian arrived. Brian was 67 and had been given a spa day voucher by his daughter for his birthday in March, which was now 4 months ago, and he had been meaning to use it since then, but had not gotten around to it, partly because he wasn't entirely sure what happened at a spa, and partly because he'd been regrouting the bathroom, which had taken longer than expected. He presented his voucher to Philippa with the careful precision of a man handing over a document of some importance. Philippa smiled warmly and explained what was included. Brian listened with the concentrated expression of someone attending a briefing. He asked if he needed to bring anything. Philippa said, "No, everything was provided." Brian said he'd brought his own towel just in case. Philippa said that was absolutely fine. Brian folded the voucher twice, and put it in his pocket even though he no longer needed it, and followed Philippa down the corridor towards the changing rooms, looking at the pebble prints as he passed them, and deciding not to say anything about them, which was the correct decision. By 11 a.m, the spa had reached what Robert considered its operational peak, which meant that 4 of the 6 treatment rooms were occupied. Gerald had checked the pool pH twice, and the reception desk had fielded 3 phone calls, 2 of which were bookings, and 1 of which was a man asking if they did haircuts, which they did not and had never done. Though there had been a brief conversation in 2020 about adding a hair station, which had not progressed beyond Robert writing the word hair with a question mark on a post-it note that was still attached to the inside of his desk drawer. Robert himself spent the late morning doing what he did every morning, which was walking slowly around the spa in a manner he described as a wellness check, and which mostly involved looking at things that were fine and confirming to himself that they were fine. He checked the temperature gauge outside the sauna, which read 47, and gave it the same small nod Gerald reserved for pH levels. He straightened a leaflet on the reception desk that had not been crooked, but was now very slightly straighter. He looked at the water feature on the wall for a moment, as he always did, with the expression of a man who has accepted something but not entirely made peace with it. And then he moved on. Sandra was in the steam room corridor, replacing the folded towels on the shelf outside the door, with fresh folded towels that were identical in every measurable way to the ones she had removed. She did this with the quiet precision of someone who had understood that the difference between a spa and an ordinary warm room was largely a matter of correctly folded towels. A guest emerged from the steam room as she was finishing, a woman in her 50s wearing a robe that was slightly too large for her, which was the only size issue the spa had ever had, and which Robert had noted in a meeting in 2022, and which remained, as of this morning, unresolved. The woman said it was very warm in there. Sandra said, yes, it was a steam room. The woman said, right, yes, of course. And they smiled at one another in the way people smile when a conversation has reached its natural conclusion, but neither party has yet moved. Brian emerged from the men's changing room at 11:20, wearing his robe, which he had tied with considerable thoroughness, and his own towel draped over one arm, because he had brought it, and felt it would be wasteful not to use it. He made his way to the pool area, which was a long rectangular room with white tiles, a skylight through which the grey sky was visible, and 4 white plastic loungers arranged along one side, each with a neatly rolled towel on it, which Brian looked at, and then looked at his own towel, and then looked back at theirs. He chose a lounger at the far end, placed his towel on top of their towel, and sat down. He looked at the pool for a while. The pool was very still and very blue, and gave no indication that it intended to do anything. Brian found this restful. He sat there for some time, not swimming, not reading, not sleeping, just sitting in the particular way of a man who has arrived somewhere unfamiliar and decided that the best approach is to observe it carefully before committing to anything. Gerald appeared at the far end of the pool at 11:34, with his kit in his Ziploc bag, which he removed from his breast pocket with practiced ease. He dipped the tester, held it up, read it, wrote 7.3 in the logbook, and was about to leave when Brian said, "What are you testing for?" Gerald stopped. He turned. He looked at Brian with the expression of a man who has been asked, after years of patient waiting, exactly the right question. He said, "pH levels." Brian said, "Right." Gerald said, 7.3. Brian nodded slowly, as if this meant something to him, which it did not. Gerald said, "Ideal range is 7.2 to 7.6. Brian said, "That seemed like a fairly narrow window." Gerald said it was, and that most people didn't appreciate how narrow it was, and that in fact the consequences of straying outside that range were quite significant in terms of both swimmer comfort and equipment longevity. Brian said he could imagine. He could not imagine, but he felt it was the right thing to say. Gerald looked at him for a moment with something approaching warmth, which for Gerald was essentially warmth, and then replaced his kit in his Ziploc bag and went back the way he had come. And Brian sat back on his lounger and looked at the pool again, which was still very still and very blue, and seemed, if anything, slightly more interesting now that he knew about the pH levels. The day passed in the way that days at the spa always passed, which was slowly and without incident, and in a manner that satisfied everyone present without exciting any of them. 3 more guests arrived between midday and 2 o'clock. 2 of them had the seaweed wrap, which Sandra administered with the focused calm of a woman who had wrapped a significant number of people in seaweed and intended to wrap a significant number more. The 3rd guest, a quiet man named Paul, who had booked a reflexology session, fell asleep during the treatment and woke up looking briefly confused about where he was, and then remembered and nodded and went to get changed. He left a 5-star review that evening which said simply, "Very relaxing, would return." Robert read it twice and printed it out. Lunch at the spa was a quiet affair. There was no restaurant, which had been discussed at length in mid-2016 and again in late 2018. And both times the conversation had arrived at the conclusion that a small refreshment area would be sufficient. And the refreshment area had been fitted with a counter, a kettle, a small selection of herbal teas arranged in a wicker basket, and a glass dome containing shortbread biscuits that were replenished every Tuesday and Thursday by Sandra, who kept the spare ones in a tin in the staff room with a posted note on it that said spa biscuits not for general use, which everyone respected. Robert ate his lunch at his desk, which was a sandwich he had made that morning, and which was exactly the sandwich he always made, and which he ate while reading a facilities management newsletter that he had been subscribed to for 8 years, and had never once considered unsubscribing from. By 3 o'clock, the pool had been used by 4 guests, none of whom had swum in any meaningful sense, but had instead moved through the water at a considered pace in the way that people do when they're not truly there for the swimming. Gerald had checked the pH once more, recorded 7.3, and allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite pride, but was in the same postcode as it. Philippa had answered 14 questions at reception, the most common of which was where the changing rooms were, and the most unusual of which was whether the spa sold the pebble prints, which it did not, though Philippa said she would check, and then forgot, and then remembered again at 4 o'clock, when the guest had already left. The afternoon brought a lull, as it always did, between 3:30 and 5, during which the spa settled into an even quieter version of its usual quiet. Tom finished the last treatment of the day, a 70-minute deep tissue massage for a man named Clive, who said nothing for the entire 70 minutes except for "that's the spot" at the 40-minute mark, which Tom noted internally as good feedback. Sandra restocked the towels. Gerald wiped down the pool surround with the long-handled mop he had named nothing because he was not that kind of person, but which he did treat with a certain level of consideration. Brian had left at 2 after sitting by the pool for the better part of 2 hours, having eventually decided against swimming on the grounds that the water looked very settled, and he didn't want to disturb it. He collected his things and returned his spa towel to Philippa, and then remembered his own towel, which he retrieved from the lounger, and folded it carefully before leaving. He said to Philippa on his way out that it had been very nice. Philippa said she was glad. Brian said he might come back. Philippa said they would love that, and he left, and it was very possible that he meant it. By 5:30 the last guests had gone, and the spa had returned to the particular stillness of a place that has done what it set out to do, and is now simply waiting for tomorrow. The rain, which had been there all day in the background like a piece of furniture no one had moved, was still falling. At 5:47, Sandra put on her coat, which was navy and had been described on the label as a raincoat, though she had never fully tested this claim and was not planning to tonight, as she had an umbrella. She said goodnight to Robert, who was still at his desk, and Robert said, "Good night, Sandra." And Sandra said, "See you tomorrow." And Robert said, "Yes." And that was that. She walked to her car, which was parked in the same spot she always parked in, started it, and drove home in the rain, which was still doing what it had been doing all day, which was raining. Gerald left at 5:52, which was 2 minutes later than usual, because he had gone back to check the pool pH1 final time, which read 7.3, which he recorded in the logbook, and then closed with the quiet satisfaction of a man completing a sentence he had started correctly. He put on his new coat, which he had bought at Marks and Spencer the previous Saturday. It was a dark green, which was not what he had gone in for. He had gone in for the yellow one, which he had seen on the website, and which had seemed practical and visible in low-light conditions, both of which he considered important qualities in an outer garment. The yellow one had not been in the sale. The green one had been reduced by 30%, which was a significant reduction, and was also waterproof, which the label confirmed, and which Gerald intended to verify this evening without particularly meaning to. He said goodnight to Philippa, who said, "Good night, Gerald," and he walked out into the rain, which immediately confirmed that the coat was, at minimum water-resistant, and he made a mental note to update his assessment once he had more data. Philippa left at 6 o'clock, which was when she always left, not a minute before and not a minute after, because she was that kind of person, and had always been that kind of person, and expected she always would be. She put on a coat that was beige, and had been described by the woman in the shop as a classic, which Philippa had taken to mean it would not go out of fashion, which suited her, as she had no intention of replacing it. She turned off the light in reception, which plunged the pebble prints into darkness, and locked the front door, and stood for a moment under the awning in the way that people do when they're about to walk into rain and are giving themselves a moment to accept it. Then she accepted it and walked to the bus stop. Tom had left at 5 o'clock, as he always did on Tuesdays and Thursdays, quietly and without ceremony by the side door, in a jacket that was not really warm enough for the weather, but which he had been wearing since October, and not yet admitted was insufficient. He had 4 stars worth of feedback waiting for him on the spa system, none of which he had read yet, and a leftover half packet of rice cakes in his bag, and no particular plans for the evening except to be at home, which was plan enough. Robert was last, as he always was. He walked through the spa one final time, checking that the things that were always fine were still fine, which they were. He straightened a towel that didn't need straightening. He looked at the water feature. He turned off the corridor lights, one by one, and the taupe carpet disappeared into darkness, and the steam room and the salt cave that wasn't a salt cave, and the pool with its 7.3 pH level, all became simply rooms in the dark, waiting. He put on his coat, which was charcoal grey, and was from the same range as Sandra's, but in a different colour, which neither of them knew, and which would not have particularly surprised either of them. He locked the back door, then checked it, then walked to his Volvo, and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, as he always did, for no reason he had ever examined. He drove home through the rain. The spa sat quietly behind him, doing nothing, which it was very good at. Tomorrow it would open at 8 o'clock. Gerald would check the pH. Sandra would check the sauna. Philippa would smile at the door. Robert would walk around confirming that things were fine. And the guests would come and be wrapped and warmed and floated gently through their treatments by people who took quiet and genuine pride in the smooth and unremarkable passing of a day. And it would all be as it always was, and as everyone there secretly hoped it would always remain. Perfectly, completely, and contentedly fine. And so, my friend, as the spa settles into its quiet night, so too can you settle into yours. Let the gentle rhythm of ordinary days, the comfort of routine, the peace of things being exactly as they should be, carry you now into deep and restful sleep. Good night.